Good morning once again to you all. This is the second part of our morning of our second day in this doctoral seminar, Peace and European Values as a Potential Model for Integration and Progress in a Global World. Next, we have a table, that is directed by the president of this academic foundation, Juan Carlos Moreno. He's a professor, he has been a professor in law, and he focuses on research and management of different organizations, and he will be the moderator of the next speaker. Thank you, Miguel. A very good morning to you all. It is a satisfaction to introduce Enrique Hernández Díez, who is the researcher who's going to be doing the presentation. Since this is the first time I talk today, I would like to do a small reflection to the researchers that are here today. You're 10 researchers, not by chance, not by mere chance, not by a draw. We had 109 applications for this Sofia Corradi scholarship. 109 from all over Europe. Unfortunately, only 10 were successful. I wish there were many more, but 10 of you have been elected, have been selected. This is a merit for you in your life. The jury of the Sofia Corradi scholarship, several of us are here. We've had a hard work. We've all gone over and over your research, your curriculum, in order to try and be fair. I don't know if we have been 100% fair, but honestly, we have strived to do so. And those of you here, I think you should be very proud and very happy because you're one of the 10 people that have been selected all over Europe for with the Sofia Corradi scholarship. That will be with you for the rest of your life. Tomorrow I'll speak lots more, but today I'm not going to get more into detail. When I review Enrique's file and his curriculum, two things caught my eye, and I had them into account. First, research, but the second one is the social commitment that he has. Europe is not about researchers who are inside a room constantly thinking about things. Thinking is only good when it is applied to practice in daily life and is taken to others. We do not want guinea pigs, we do not want rat labs. We want young researchers that are committed to Europe and the social reality. And I am sure and certain that Enrique is one of them. He's also part of the Scout movement, Amnesty International. He has been president of the Council of Youth in Extremadura and Spanish vice president of the Youth Council in Spain. I think these are merits that, together with his research, make him a proper deserving of the Sofia Corradi scholarship. I think now that he is full-time PhD researching, I ask of you to continue with one thing, but also the social commitment. One thing without the other is nothing. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Bueno, si todo va bien, mañana.
If everything goes all right, I will return to that commitment. If I can go and take the plane to France, because I was in a children's camp. But it's better if I continue with research, so my PhD director will be at ease. Thank you to the foundation, and thank you to Professor Corradi for initiating these grants that have allowed me to present something that it has no place in other areas. What I research has very low weight And the fact that I'm doing it from the area or the field of law, it makes it quite strange. I hope to be the same level of my colleagues. I'm trying to focus as if it were as a four-time music. I will try to carry that rhythm to facilitate, even if I'm not going to use slides or a presentation, because I'm not able to look at two places at the same time and to keep my eyes on my paper and the slides. I prefer to focus on the papers I have in front of me. I have tried also to adapt, and I advise you this, to ask for your indulgence, that I won't change the contents of the paper, but I will change the way in which I present it to link it better with what you, with those of you who have had the floor before me and that have inspired me. What am I going to tell you? I'm going to try and speak on what is at the point of crisis of the lack of participation of youth at a European level. Joseph Stiglitz has spoken of that at both sides of the Atlantic, and although there has always been a generation differences, they are getting more radical. For example, in the sense of vote, in economic conditions as had never been ever before in probably Eurocentric history, but which is the one that affects us in the European Union. I'm going to try to approach you to that reality from some legal note. There are other people from sociology, psychology, anthropology, etc., that have approached the topic, and they're helping me to try and invent something that asking for a law that has to be different, or analyze if the existing law corresponds with the aims of the treaties of the European Union. What is the point of what I'm going to say? The best way to explain why I think that what I'm going to say is useful is to link it to some of the phrases or the words or messages that you have already given. Professor Elbert, in an informal conversation at the swimming pool on Sunday, launched the question, what is for you, the youngsters, the European Union? It shouldn't be a cafeteria or a swimming pool question. It should be transferred to the authorities. That should be participation. It should be something different from a cafeteria talk. We should be regulated legally as well. This is what I'm going to try to speak about. Professor Corradi spoke also of how in her initiative, when she was around 30 years, when she was after the minister in the corridor, she was called young lady in a condescending manner. Well, the initiatives of some youngsters are simply despised because they come from kids, niñato in Spanish, as I have been called in the university environment. Another comments of Professor Corradi will be present in some of my comments. There are illegal or almost illegal initiatives that eventually may be regulated. Anna spoke of the importance of memory. The importance of memory recalled me of the reflection made after the two world wars in youth participation. And in Denmark, after the war, some people reflected on how people had gone to the war with a youth generation through decision makers that were not in the front line, but they were the other generation. We saw that in the German cemetery. Bettina spoke of the importance of the international humanitarian law, and precisely now the youth is not just a subject to receive rights, but also to promote those rights, to transform the society in a better manner than some adults. But this is something that was already in the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union with the Solidarity Corps. Maria Teresa spoke of borders. And I think this is one of the clear examples where there is a political generation gap. How we are approaching one and the other generations this crisis. I wouldn't say that some have the whole truth and that one generation has the truth and the other hasn't. But there are different trends, and Jairo has challenged us to the problem of Eurocentrism, and he inspired me to one of the conflicts among youth organizations and the process of youth participation. The Council of Youth in Spain and in Portugal in 2014, that is the most representative spaces of youth, they simply declined to participate in the Ibero-American space, giving up to representatives only to countries, to representatives from Latin America, when the Portuguese and the Spaniards were not in favor of that. I will explain the 3 times. First, I'm going to contribute some concepts, because when we speak of youth participation, it seems an easy topic. What is the meaning of youth and what is the concept of participation at the EU level? After that, one of the questions that come up is what can the EU do on these themes, which is, generally speaking, little. But even if it is little, I will try to show that it is very important, because the rest of the states or the member states usually simply limit themselves to what the EU does. After those competences and those goals, and ending with the introduction, I will try to be quick in this. I will talk about the key actors. When we speak of youth participation, it is not the President of the Commission or the European Parliament talking with youngsters in a small village in Europe. There are some agents that represent institutions of all the youth, or the main youth organized groups, who are the ones who usually participate, and we have to name them and to try and follow them and to see how they have an influence in the creation of law. The second tempo will be, I know it's important, it's difficult to digest what has already gone, and we are almost in the donkey's siesta. Before lunch is donkey's siesta. Please proceed to sleep a little if you wish to indulge in that, but I will try to talk about primary law, secondary law, in terms of youth participation, and the most important, although it is not necessarily binding, and it's difficult to say how it is applied, soft law, which is the most frequent in the EU. The third tempo is the more provocative. I try to offer you 6 questions for debate, or 6 legal challenges for youth participation in Europe, from taking experiences from the United Nations to regional areas. And the 4th tempo will be for provisional conclusions of my paper, and open to your contributions. Once I have talked about the scheme, I will go into the concepts. What do I mean with youth in the EU, or youth participation in the EU? There is a collective idea that youth is a concept that has changed a lot through centuries or millennia, getting into a wider range of age, taking into account the Greek references. It is surprising for me that in the Athena's constitution by Aristotle, the beginning in the Pericles it should be done when they were 18 years of age, and it stopped when they were 30 years of age. So think of the life expectancy in Greece, and to consider that youth ended at 30 years of age. Military service or civic service in Greece was at the age of 20. They could not be elected until later. This concept has evolved a lot, and now we are in a society which is called juvenilization. Being young is something socially attractive, because one is usually stronger, more handsome, usually healthier, but no one who has given up youth is ready to take precarization or other things. So there's a juvenilization of marketing, but not necessarily all the elements. In a generation that, according to the United Nations, has been the worst treated by the economic crisis. So most of the poor in the world are youngsters, and most youngsters are impoverished. In a region like this one, in Extremadura, and the data, I have had to work upon them a lot, more than 50% in the last years has the highest risk of poverty in under 30 years of age. In Europe, we're not talking of malnutrition or extreme poverty or severe deprivation, but yes, we're talking of certain marginalization. The problem is that the concept of youth is being related with precarization. It has to be enlarged until the 35 years range. But this is probably a trap, because we are relating youngsters with vulnerability and precarization situation when it shouldn't be like that. To turn to the next concept, and I have very little time, and I have only started. Imagine a deer, a young deer, and a wolf comes around. If the deer is not ready to walk and run after a few hours of being born, he would fall prey of a predator. If we were a human, with humans, it's not exactly the same. Auxiliary signs of law signal that youth exists because the human being requires longer education processes. Is slower in learning, but he learns more. Currently, we speak of about 80 million youngsters or youth in the European Union. Under 20% is the aged continent. We are a demographic minority, and if they are in agreement, they are a minority vote as well. The same. The example is Brexit. The youth lost, and the same happened with the elections in the US, preferring Sanders instead of Clinton, and then losing when Clinton lost to Trump. Most norms in the EU refer to the 15 to 29 or 30 years. There are exceptions, and there are different frameworks. The UN speak from 15 to 25. Other countries have different ranks. For instance, in Spain, 14 is the age for certain rights. But the concept of youth should be flexible, because it is a transition concept. One thing is the coming of age. Funny thing is that in ancient Rome, the civil age, the right to be able to buy a house or to handle heritage, you didn't get it through age, but because your father died or you were emancipated. It was not related to age. A Roman consul that voted in the Republic voted since he was 14, who could be a consul at 30 years of age, but he couldn't buy a house because his father was still alive. So this element was flexible. Macron couldn't be a president in Germany because he doesn't reach the age required in Germany. It is something that has no red lines. What do I understand by participation? I'm talking of participation at a public level in common topics, not participation in commerce, but the participation of a society that are trying to be active in public sphere, as Adela Cortina referred to in one of her comments. Procedural participation to create opportunities or spaces, even temporal spaces, so that you can give your opinion, launch a proposal, or have your opinion on the proposal of other. And then the organic one, that there should be a concrete place, not necessarily physical, institution, collegial space where a youngster or a youth can have the opportunity to say something. That is what I refer to when speaking of participation. I can clarify these things later if there's any question. What can the EU do on this matter, which is marking one of the process of lack of affection from a generation that has been against Brexit and has lost in Britain. And although this group doesn't like some of the policies of Europe, but they want to participate in them, but there is a clear gap. The national elections in many countries show this. The EU can do only support, coordination, and complement elements, which is what Article 6 of the functioning treaty can provides. Only states can have policies. The EU only supports. So the EU normally proposes, the states accept. I will help. Well, your help is the only thing I'm going to do, is what the state says. If the ILO said that $10 billion were necessary for youth, the EU said, I'm going to invest 1 billion, and we will need the other 9 billion by the states for employment. Well, the states say, I will invest only what the EU invest. And this is what sometimes is done only by states. Those are the competences or the jurisdiction. What are the aims? We will see that when we go to the treaties and the contents. But the EU has taken the legal translation, the legal tradition of constitutions in the member states. The first one that speaks of youth participation, which I found by chance, is the French Constitution of 1792, which distinguishes between children and youths. And the Assembly of 1792 is responsible of gaining the love and affection from the young citizens. There are no references until the 20th century, after the Second World War, but many states have that. And there are two dimensions that the European Union has gotten from there. The youth has a collective that has to be protected because they're learning, they are evolving, and they need support. And on the other hand, the European Union incorporates a different dimension, a more modern one that is only present in the Spanish Constitution, but that has taken to the treaties. Youth have to be protected, but of course, not all youth need protection. No? The grandchildren of a banker, like the Botín, the Santander banker, do not need exactly the same protection as others. Those protectionist objectives appear in 165 and 162. 66 appear in the functioning treaty. Why can the EU? Why can't the EU do more? We are not talking of sovereignty, or it's not a very media-prone thing. In some meetings, parties show youth behind the speakers. It is a marketing issue, which corresponds with that juvenilization. That is why they don't want to give up the power, although this is my own political interpretation, not necessarily legal. who are the ones who deal the cards in the EU. They have to be protected in employment and promote their participation, because law will give some principles. Participation has to be free, efficient, and has to tend to be complete. So it's participation in growth. The actors, and I have invented this while I was writing, youth participants. Youth have not only a right to participate in topics that affect them as youth, in the design of youth policies. They are also rank and file citizens that have responsibilities at all the levels, and they should participate in whatever is interesting for them. From the smallest municipality to the Commission of the Parliament have specialized units for youth. There are interlocutors. That institution, I know I speak very, and thank you to the interpreters, but I speak very quick. No, well, I can't hear you, but I'll try to speak a little slower. Those institutions that have a department, a specialized department devoted to youth, are the natural interlocutor for that, and they have to speak with youth because they exist because of that. There is a European Commissioner that, on top of sport and training, takes care of youth. So there is a department in the European Union. Parliament has not a formal commission, but an intergroup. I don't know if you know about the intergroups, where there is not a commission, there are alliances, informal alliances or formal processes among European members of parliament. And it has a lot of weight because it designs with youth organizations the Solidarity Corps these days. And the European Council, the meeting of ministers, which has not an obvious formula of ministers of youth. In many countries, they don't exist. It is a third or fourth degree level. In our case, it has to do with health. I don't know the relationship between health and youth, but that's the case in Spain. But there is an organ, a body among governments who are the ones that call the shots. And in youth policies, there is every 6 months they meet in youth conferences. Every rotation of the presidency in the EU, and usually in the country that presides over the EU. Who are present there? 60 or 80 million cannot sit at the table with those interlocutors who speak on their behalf. And this is one of the problems that I will handle later about legitimization of the representatives. We have the lack in Europe that we have civil society, which is the strongest in the world in means, but also in representativity. So they meet the highest number of organizations, the European Youth Forum. But if states are the one who make the decisions, there is a figure in 1940 appears in Denmark, which is generalized in Europe. The councils of youth in national states. Only Hungary doesn't have one. The Spanish one was about to be closed, but the rest of them has one. In each country, they are more or less representative. In France, there was a crisis because the government wasn't interested in representative, so they created a different organ. So now they have two problems, two organs that are scarcely representative. But in all countries, there is an interlocutor, which represents not youth associations, and non-parliamentary, it has no sovereignty, but represents the general interests of a collective nature, sometimes a bit blurred, of all youth, not corporate interests of associations. They are not defending the subsidies of their own associations, but to defend the youth's rights. They got legitimization, the European Youth Forum has interposed a demand to the government of Belgium for having established fraud of non-remunerated practices in their countries. Hopefully there will be a decision on that favorable to the youth. How does it work, the European law on this? Very limited. For those of you who don't belong to the law field, I reiterate the difference between primary law, the block of constitutionalization is not a constitution, which is the original of the primary laws, of the primary treaties, primary law treaties, I'm sorry, the Article 6, the 165, 166, and 214. I don't think it is necessary to talk of those contents. Then we have, if there were a legal effort in that field, there should be a secondary law in regulations, directives that are binding or not, depending on the framework. There are very few, and it is mainly finance of some of the programs, and occasionally they are the only finance. For instance, we spoke of Erasmus grants, and the only finance has been that of the EU, and in Erasmus, my Erasmus finance allowed me to pay my beers and not much more. And then we have soft law, which is the most developed one, which it relates to this seminar. It talks to values, but it transforms that in a legal principle that allow us to interpret what is necessary. And in that framework, we have the demand in Belgium. I have only 15 minutes for the next two tempos. I will at least enunciate them. Third tempo, the 6 questions for debate. And this is perhaps the most innovative of my presentation, because I've been quite descriptive. There are some fundamental principles that have not been applied in Europe, although there is a youth participation law which is quite developed. But in other regions, they have stronger instruments in legal terms in the defense of youth and their participation. There are 2 catalogs of rights, treaty law, the Ibero-American Youth Law, which involve Spain and Portugal, that if they were applied with all the doctrinal interpretations of youth participation, would force Spain to change the age of the voting age. Spain has signed it, but it is not transferred into the national legislation. The Ibero-American Convention and the African Youth Charter, or Youth Rights Youth. We have many catalogs in Europe, and very well followed, like that of the Council of Europe, not that much of the European Union. But these instruments is one of the debatable elements. Is it necessary a catalog? Is it necessary to make it concrete the rights for the group? The Convention on the Rights of the Child has a committee, etc. exist. We should debate whether part of that should be applied here. Parts of the United Nations say that it wouldn't be necessary another catalog for the youth. But why not having other ranks of age, for instance, childhood? For example, the committee of the rights of the child follows up how the rights are applied in each country, and when there is a failure in the national courts, they come to the fore. Then another example, the parallel reports through international treaties of the rights of the child. All countries are forced to present a report how they comply with the rights of the child. To compensate what the states say and to check whether it is right or not, the civil society asks for, or rather the United Nations asks the civil society for a parallel report. organizations such as Save the Children and other organizations will supervise if what the state says is right or not. And this is quite useful in order to process some of the, or to challenge some of the non-compliance. Participation. We participate because there is a norm, and if they don't participate, it's because they don't want to. But to participate, one has to know how, with whom, etc. Can you participate? So there should be created a number of processes of participation. The idea of ladder was proposed by a sociologist. Participation is not like being pregnant. Either you are or you're not. Participation, you can participate or in a certain degree. It's not the same to participate in a consultation or to launch your own proposal. It is not the same that you are asked for for an idea or that you force a government. The idea of going behind a minister in the corridors to propose the Erasmus grants. This concept should be at a higher degree, and law should be applied in a manner that participation initiatives should be in the framework of institutions, and only later the institution has the possibility of proposing other initiatives. We are anticipating changes in society, and we would like the participation to be scaled up. Third question, the crisis of legitimacy, and this gives a lot of headaches. There is a funny study that was asked to be done to a sociologist by the Council of Europe, consultative spaces with capacity of all the members, not of the Union, but the Council of Europe, 49 states. The first conclusion is that the majority of the efforts of the organs led by youth, created or recognized by law in the states, devote most of their effort to guarantee that they are useful. Most of the time, they are questioned, and they have to devote their effort to that, so they can do other things. So this is the crisis of legitimacy. I have heard in this country that the representation of the rights of the workers is represented by the Ministry of Work and not by the trade unions. This is not included into the ideas of those who create norms, the decision makers. And this creates problems because we lose a lot of time as youth organizations. There are corporate risks of an excessive legitimacy given to a particular association. For instance, when a state wishes to speak with an organization but not with all, if it has the liberty to choose one, it will be more comfortable. In France, for instance, they changed one institution and created another one to make a different composition and to adapt it to the desire of the government. I'll try to be finishing in time. Fourth question for debate or for dialogue. New formulas and names that are being created legally in the EU are very important for youth, but they are not regulated to generate subjective youth rights. They're very nice declarations, but if the country in particular does not respect them, is difficult. I don't know whether you know structured dialogue, which is a non-binding norm. The European Union commits itself to talk to youth, and it abandons the practice of talking to youth only when electoral processes start. They normally speak every 18 months, three rotation presidencies. They will speak with representatives from youth people, from top down and down to the top, or from bottom to the top, and this is working. But if one country does decide not to do anything, nothing happens, and this is a problem too. There are trends to eliminate interlocutors or these processes, in the sense that they destabilize the tranquility of the political interlocutor. The investment of Spain in the first year was €2,000 for the whole process at state level in structured dialogue. €2,000. If anything came from there, is because other actors from the civil society generated consultation processes directed to the youth, etc. This is an emerging process, but that should be taken into account because it is in a framework which is almost illegal or lacking regulation. Fifth question. There is something which is little known that I have heard very difficult time to find out. There is a joint partnership between the EU and the Council of Europe in matters of youth. They have databases, researchers. I have already registered myself there, and there are other hundreds, several hundreds of them. And they're trying to accelerate the knowledge on these problems, democratic, social, educational problems of youth. However, this tool is being not sufficiently being utilized, because when representatives from the EU or the Council of Europe go to the United Nations, there were people who didn't even know that there was that partnership, that joint partnership in their own institutions. So this is still in its beginning. If this partnership would be utilized more, this would accelerate the process of not necessarily a moralist or just giving lessons to anyone. The European Youth Forum does not collect only youth from the EU, more than the Council of Europe. In the European Forum, there are 50 states. Belarus is not in the Council, but it participates there. So it is a privileged interlocutor. Sixth question. Cooperation between the United Nations and the EU is not being sufficiently harnessed. The EU has a program, I will refer only to one, which is very attractive, with decades of experience in the Netherlands, the young delegates of the United Nations. I don't know whether it sounds familiar. In the Netherlands, it's very well developed. In others, it's not even implemented. There's no agreement here in Spain on that, but it is a structure which is quite interesting. The EU facilitates a process of elections with variable kind of voting. Each country decides who has to have the right. In Holland or in the Netherlands, all youth can vote. They can vote, and they have a direct dialogue with the Office of the Secretary General of the UN in participation processes in order to, for instance, design the Sustainable Development Goals. It has the same logic as the two consuls of the Roman Republic. Each one should have the veto right against the other, like the two consuls, as I said. So they can. There should be two, and this favors mutual veto and mutual participation, which is working well in many of the European countries. But this is ignored by the European Union. So the EU could have two youngsters with the highest legitimacy that each country has, either universal vote or through youth associations. So this would be a very good element. Other issues referred to United Nations would be interesting, but the United Nations could also learn from the structured dialogue. Fourth tempo on my end, provisional conclusions. There is this very scarce binding law in the EU because there's no jurisdiction to force or to impose that, which is generating different speeds EU in countries. Greece invests 11 times more in third age than in youth, 34 times more in Spain than what it invests in youth. So there is no clear correspondence or correlation. The EU, and I don't want to be or to sound demagogic like a demagogue, the EU invests 7 times more on cows, not in agricultural policies, more on cows than on youth. Youth of Europe adopt a cow because that will be very cost effective. So there are many disparities. There are countries of the Union like Slovenia that have approved the free the free cost of higher education, and Spain is doing exactly the opposite. Competition does not affect, or rather, competence shouldn't be a problem. There could be a delegation of part of the responsibilities to states. We have at stake the equity of many people. The living or the existing law allows that one citizen participates 1 year in one form and the next one in a different form. We should change norms because they are being outdated at lightning speed. Financial programs that exist are important, but there are two challenges. The EU, each time the Commission gives a draft to the Council, to the European Council, made up of states, in the youth participation, it is immediately cut down. In the youth guarantee, the Commission suggested the Council that representatives of youth would participate in the design and the follow-up of the youth guarantee. The Council adopted youth will participate in the design of the youth guarantee. It eliminated the representative, who are those youth, and they eliminated follow-up, so that they disarmed the line that wanted to be followed by the institutions, the European institutions themselves. I'm out of time. The creation of norms on youth is showing the lack of academic rigor, norms not based on facts or empirical basis. We know too little what is being regulated when laws are enacted in Europe, and this generates the irrationality of many norms. The funniest example is also from Spain. I will be closing with this, is when the government of Spain, based on the economic crisis, simply cancels the Council of Youth, because by eliminating it, they will save 2 million euro. It is anecdotal, the amount of money that was supposed to be saved. But when the norm was approved, is that all the heritage will go to the Institute of Youth, which is the government's instrument. So the real savings is €0. A participatory organ is cancelled for economic reasons, but there are no saving because the heritage continues to be spent from the government and not from the participatory space. A clear example of normative irrationality that should be analyzed. I'm very sorry for the speed, and thank you for the effort. And congratulations to the interpreters. I went over 2.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique, for your presentation. Has been undoubtedly very interesting. I think it will raise some questions among your colleagues. I would like to ask you just one question. I do not want to get into the technical or legal data, but rather I would like to gather your personal opinion about something that you said at the beginning of your presentation. You discussed the participation of young people in Europe, and you used the word radicalization as if at present, I think it was the word because I noted that down, but I'm not sure that that was what you meant, but a higher commitment in your own words. I think that is what you meant, and I have two questions. Why do you think that commitment or radicalization is bigger now than in other times? And I was thinking about the May in France. Why do you think there is a bigger commitment now? And second, if that there is a radicalization of higher commitment, do you think it is exclusively because of the economic crisis, or is there something else? When I mention the word radicalization, I actually meant the radicalization of the political and economic gap, not so much the radicalization of political processes that brings another risk, because there is a higher gap between political stances of adults and young people in all along Europe, and those adults look with a kind face the gap in other countries, like for instance French adults are happy because young English people are against the Brexit, or because young Americans were pro-Clinton or pro-Sanders, but in their own country it has a rejection, and they think, for instance, in Spain, that young Spanish people are stupid. So that's what I meant by radicalization, that the gap is growing bigger, and that is something that has been already analyzed and assessed by sociology, not law. Why? Well, probably the UN was right when it said that those that suffer more in the Western world is the young people, because when cuts have been made, were the first ones to suffer those cuts were those minorities when it comes to election. So my parents are older than 65, and they earn more even though they are retired, and they pay more in public services than me, that I was unemployed a few months ago, and that generates frustration. I think that the book of Stefan Hessel, Indignate Yourselves, that is something that was the catalyst as well here on the movement of the 15th of May. I think that usually there is a more sensitive generational peak. We've suffered that with the economic crisis, but those who are 13 and 14, these people are less sensitive. The baby boom generation here in Spain lived the transition, and it left a big imprint in them, and that is why they have a different opinion towards the young people. Those who were young in May '68 in France are more sensitive now towards the young. We cannot be provoking this type of events to have more sensitive young people and adults, but what is happening is that from a legal and institutional point of view is that we are left in it by chance. So there are events that are making more sensitive young people instead of planning a more sensitive generation, so that people are not just waiting for a revolt to happen or revolution to happen. And now these young people or adolescents, those that are 13 and 14 years of age, they're talking less and less about public affairs, because I believe that there is no planning serving that strategy. Thank you. Bettina, you have a question? Regina afterwards.
Muchas gracias por su presentación.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. One related to participation, how to increase participation of young people at the European level. In that regard, I wanted to ask you whether you see any potential on the European Citizen Initiative. Now, we see that in order to submit initiatives, conditions are changing. So, do you know whether these young associations are being consulted on this Citizen European Initiative? That was my first question. On the other hand, about a year and a half or so ago, there was a resolution of the Security Council on youth and peace. I know that one of the achievements of young people was that youth were not portrayed as violent actors in armed conflicts or after armed conflict, because apparently there is this perception of young people as dangerous and violent actors. So my question is the following. You said that at European Union level there are two axes, the protection of youth and the promotion of youth. And so I wanted to know whether you knew that whether after terrorist attacks in Europe this perception of young people has changed. Thank you. Thank you for the two questions. They're deep questions. First, on how to increase this participation in Europe, and what is the role of the initiative of young people in Europe. Well, that is an instrument that is generalized in some states, in some better than others. Europe still has an initiative model that is pretty restrictive, that is, as long as we do not decrease the number of signatures that are needed, I don't think the youth will participate. And participative youth is a minority as well within the youth itself. And it's not that youth is bad. In fact, participation of young and adults are pretty similar. But if youth is a demographical minority and is civic, then reaching the range of these type of initiatives is almost impossible. I think that the European Youth Forum has even not thought of discussing. I do not know really, but I don't think it has been taken serious. Some states tried to discuss it, but others did not. In Spain, for instance, we change our educational laws every time we change government, pretty much. And so organization tried to pass a legislative education that would not change every time the government changed. But that affected a fundamental right, and so the change could not be based on a citizen initiative. So it was not lack of initiative, lack of potential, but it was because the constitution does not allow so. So they're interesting tools because they allow us to launch initiatives, but as they are today, they're very conservative. They're in the line of the first models that were used in Switzerland in 19th century, and they're insufficient. I think that more than an initiative on regulations, we should foresee channels on political initiatives, because otherwise the thing that they will say to not accept it is because it's not legally correct. Either you have legal experts on your team, or they're automatically rejected. Most initiatives are generally rejected in all countries. With regard to the UN Security Council resolution, it is true that the UN goes at several speeds, and there is an internal struggle with youth. There are different points of view, one are in favor, one against, and one that simply ignores youth issues. What is happening, I think, now at the Security Council is that the ECOSOC Youth Forum is starting to work. The Social and Economic Forum, and it gathers every year in order to launch initiatives towards the high-level fora. And I think that is having, an effect in this change of perspective. I think that in certain fora, youth are just the youth is linked to drug problems, for instance, and even in Spain, most, or at least some policies, some youth policies, are just focused on those problems. But I think that that type of forum of the United Nations, they're the first ones that are starting to make others accept that youth is a driving force for change, because it lacks prejudice, and so they take on board changes very swiftly, and it provokes them. And this ECOSOC Youth Forum, they're trying to do so with the development goals, but there's still a lot of way to do. What I find most useful about the different axes that you mentioned, I think you should consult the latest guidelines of the children's rights in Geneva, and it discusses precisely that. It says that all policies, legal at a national, international level, it says that they should protect children, protect and promote young people, and then it should try to promote rather than protect those that are young adults. I don't know if this answers your question or if I missed something. These two axes, protection and promotion, do lack a third axis as youth as danger within the European Union. It has not been set into rules because it's aesthetically ugly, but the risk of linking violence, drugs, and young people, that was a danger that was there. The Portuguese and especially the Spanish Constitution, they try to talk about promotion rather than protection, and that is something that the internal legislation of the EU has taken on board. It has not been taken as a problem, but sometimes when you hear some politicians speak, you see the danger of what they consider the youngsters and what are their problems.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the Netherlands as an example of The Hague, the youth conference of the United Nations. I myself participated in it when I was a high school student several times. We got the chance to ask questions from former Secretary General Kofi Annan. It was a great gathering of 4,000 youngsters from all around the world, and really we got to learn about lawmaking, submitting resolutions, and values such as peace and development and all these. So I really think it's a good idea for the European Union to have such an institution or such a conference available for the future. I thought that was a very good point. But my question, the question that I was about to ask, considers with the refugee crisis, with the migrant crisis that's going on, what incentive does the European Union have for the youth of the migrants or the immigrants? What can we provide for them to integrate them into Europe, to protect them from radical ideologies, to integrate them more, to give them opportunities and treatment? Are there any incentives for the migrant youth in particular?
Interesante pregunta.
That's an interesting question. This question could be shared with Teresa because she too discussed that the migratory problem, it's an issue. I wouldn't call it so much a problem, it's a challenge rather. Maybe it is being faced from the EU as a security issue rather than an opportunity in different terms. Right now, you're in a region, Extremadura, where 85% of towns have less than 500 youngsters. That is, 85% of towns are non-viable in about 10 years when it comes about social economic equity or the sustainability of public services. Immigration is necessary, is needed to have new generations, but youth unemployment, it's big, even though our pyramid is inverse, and that goes far beyond migration. I'm not aware that the EU is doing something significant in this topic. Their statements, very nice sometimes, they're very respectful of human rights, but in practical terms, then we see that the international law and welcome refugees is not being fulfilled. Other programs are being taken advantage of, like Professor Corradi's Erasmus Mundus fits everything, and sometimes is not about mobility of students, but civil society organizations are the ones that are taking on board this mobility, are having the support of the EU, and they're trying to raise some solutions. Teresa has the floor. In order to help you and lend you a hand, unfortunately, I haven't seen many mentions to young migrants, and the only time they're mentioned is in the counter-terrorism directive in order to prevent cyber terrorism of through networks, to try and avoid young people to turning to terrorists. So unfortunately, I think this is the only mention that the EU has made on young migrants. So we're following the same line as seeing the migration as a security problem. So this was all that I could say, that the only mention was on in the counter-terrorism directive, because the young are more vulnerable. I just remembered that there is a big debate, a collateral debate, which is unaccompanied minors or adolescents, or those that we do not know their age, but there is no joint strategy. The civil society spaces and the UN spaces are doing a greater task. The UN, for instance, has denounced that European boats are turning off the radars so that they do not answer SOS calls. If they have proof of that, I hope that they are taken before justice, because that is really important crime, international crime. But I think the UN is being more courageous than the EU.
Before, you spoke of the fact that the teenagers of 13 to 14 years are currently less aware of their role as citizens compared with the same age rank 4 or 5 years ago. And you said that the problem is that it is not, they're not trained in any norm or any knowledge of that kind. My question is, what are the ways to foster the participation of youngsters when they are adults? For example, courses in secondary school related with civic education, etc. Good practices exist, and there are many. The EU has plenty of examples, of small examples that are working. The problem is that states, who are the ones which have the capacity, and the EU is not perhaps giving incentives in this line, there is not a universal or general strategy. There is no unified approach. The right to participation exists, but is not focused in specific cases. An example, in Spain, there has been a discussion. I'm not sure about voting laws in other countries, but here you have the right to know who lives where in order to have publicity being sent to your own home. I receive letters from different parties in my personal address. However, institutions of youth participation, which are non-partisan organizations, don't have access to know where youngsters live in order to send them this information. I'm here, use me. The level of knowledge of youngsters about the number of associations and participation groups that exist. I don't have any statistics, but they're very limited. They don't know who the youth delegate is in their region or even in their small village. So that should be materialized in a right to information, which is the first step to education. So culture of participation should be made more universal, and there are many examples and quite simple ones. In Catalonia, for instance, it was applied for a time in certain education centers. The delegates in secondary school, the delegates of the pupils, they had one day every month where they didn't attend classes. They went to institutions that were key for the defense of their rights. The representative of trade unions, the participatory institutions, and so on. So they were empowering them, and they are chosen or elected by youngsters. This is one measure, but none of them are becoming a real right or common rights in the applicable norms of the states or of the Union. It is in a quite abstract status so far. Anna.
Very rich presentation. So let me see if I understood. You're actually saying that we should create initiatives to boost presentation of youth, which has to move from being an object of policy building, like selective policy building, to being an active actor. So is this what you're saying? Yes. And in relation to this, you're speaking about European citizenship. So when you speak about European citizenship, there are different kind of components of European citizenship, different kind of aspects that you need to consider. So if you understand European citizenship as a civic kind of identity, belonging to civic values of the European Union, this is one thing. And then, of course, you have identitarian component of European citizenship. So this being said, it has been really, really debated in the literature among policymakers about the European deficit. And it has been also debated what constitutes Europeans and what kind of future Europeans are about to have, and what is the role of the youth more specifically in this. So the European Union has been for the last 20 or 30 years trying to compensate for that so-called democratic deficit. And it created a series of projects and initiatives that specifically target the youth. So among these initiatives, I already spoke about that yesterday. There is that table that I show you, but unfortunately it was really a small screen. You couldn't maybe see it. It is a schematic representation of European citizenship. So it tells you exactly how the European Commission sees European citizenship, what kind of initiatives and objectives has to increase that kind of European citizenship, and especially in relation to the youth. And if you look at the documents of the European Commission where they speak about youth and initiatives aiming to increase European citizenship, you will see that they treat the youth as hard-to-reach category. So I'm using their own language. So for example, the Euro for Citizens program is one of those initiatives targeting youth, especially between the age of 18 and 26. So this is also a target group that they consider the youth, so between 18 and 26. A number of different other initiatives. I spoke with somebody yesterday about the Charlemagne Prize, also a new program targeting the youth. It's also a program that targets youth between the 18 and 26. And have you saw this kind of programs? Have you been studying this kind of programs and seeing, how many projects actually reach the youth, how much youth actually participates in these projects? Because they cover a series of different kind of topics, from sports, education, active remembrance, which is also a way of transmitting the messages from the past towards the future generations, as something which is in the heart of the European project. Thanks.
Gracias por la pregunta. Como hasta ahora estoy haciendo un análisis más jurídico, he profundizado menos en el desarrollo estadístico, sociológico de los programas. Aunque es verdad que como la mayor parte del derecho que hay es derecho no vinculante, prácticamente se queda en esos programas, ¿no? El programa que creo...
Sorry, it's non-binding law, I'm sorry. That's a program that should be analyzed because it is the one that is addressed more specifically to these questions. And this is one of the three pillars of Erasmus+, which has the dimension of education, the biggest one, the sports, which is the smallest, which is informal education, and Erasmus+ Youth, which is a series of specific actions in the non-formal education. In the youth Erasmus+, there is a risk, which is the old program of Youth in Action, which has replaced and improved the previous one, foresaw something that was innovative, that there could be candidacies to European funds, even informal youth groups. But with the new Erasmus+ Youth, this is almost impossible. It is not formally impossible. In practice it is, and it has been oriented, unfortunately, to the entrepreneurship dimension. There is competition of professional technicians from entrepreneurs, which are deviating funds to people who simply are devoted to that. Another severe problem is the urbanization of those funds. Regions in Spain, like the area of Madrid or Barcelona, spend most of the funds in most of the announcements, and I suppose this is the same in other countries, although it is handled by national agencies and rural areas. If there is not a clear decision by the state to empower those people to apply those programs, it is simply the natural ability of certain groups, demographic groups, that they're being urbanized and not that important for rural. For instance, Erasmus Plus Youth, only 2 projects have been used or formalized here in Extremadura, and led not by political institutions but by youth groups, and some of them have been rejected. So there is a weakness there. There are programs. I think it's being improved. There's more than there used to be, but I don't think it is being analyzed honestly, the results, because the European Union is very shy in analyzing states or governments, and states don't want to analyze many of these things because they don't want to be challenged by the opposition. So we don't want to fix any goals because we run the risk of being challenged by the opposition. I lack information, but any information that you have will be welcome. I have no data. I have been focusing mostly in the legal area rather than sociological statistics. So I don't have the Erasmus Plus youth data at a global level. So I will accept and I will collect with pleasure any proposal.
Muchas gracias, Enrique, por
Thank you, Enrique, for your presentation. Wish to ask you whether any member state has implemented, or if it would be useful to implement a quota system, as is being done with the participation of women, also to youth, both in political representation, for instance, that trade unions with representation should have a certain percentage of youths, or that in the participatory budgets there should be youths represented. That on the one hand, but on the other hand, I don't have a clear idea whether the difficulties of youth participation are related to a lack of political will in their participation, because you were saying and gave examples both in Brexit as in the United States how youth respond in quite homogeneously when they give their vote. If this were a trend in the European Union, political parties would be interested in counting with those youth. As to the first question, it is indeed a debate. The norms of states are being discussed, both in Europe and outside Europe, that prevent youth to participate in certain political positions. In the American Constitution, you cannot be a president if you are under 35, a senator under 30, and a member of the Congress when you are under 25. Well, this is being transferred here. This is nothing that happens with monarchies, for instance, where there's no coming of age for monarchs. The UN, in its youth portal, has data or the lack of proportion of public representatives in public posts in political fields. Quotas have not been mentioned, but there is a trend to try and favor, for instance, in the UN, that delegations of certain decision spaces, countries should force themselves to take young representatives, not the government youngster or youth, but those coming from youth organizations to represent their interests. And they're asking for quotas there. I know no norm whatsoever that forces or binds them to do it, but it is being promoted and it is being announced where it is not happening. For instance, the proportion of under 30 years of age in the European Parliament is anecdotal. In the 20 years, under 5 who were under 30 years of age, and those had brilliant actions. Youth guarantee came from one of these European members of parliament. And it usually is linked to their participation in youth organizations. In Britain, the youngest member of parliament, was the vice president of the European Forum of Youth, which created a great sympathy at a European level because it's one of us for the Youth Forum, irrespective of his partisan or his party conduct. Sometimes they reach certain proportions because of alliances between parties to have youths. They're not norms on quotas, but the problem of representativity and representation of youth is being discussed. And as to the lack or the goodwill or the political will or lack of it, when there is a norm, that there is a regulation, it is false, objectively speaking. Those specialists in politics will have to study with their techniques the lack or the existence of political will. But I think there is a lack of political will, or there are two levels, a very generous one for big declarations and the other one very limited for the putting into practice of those declarations. The trend, voting trend is new. This gap, where it's not automatic, of course, that who has an age under 25 or under 30 does not vote in a uniform manner. But in Iran, for instance, the parties, moderate parties, have won against the most extremist ones because the demographic pyramid are favoring that youth gain the elections. And they're voting in favor of moderate parties. But this is new. 5-10 years ago, this didn't happen. This is sociology or political information that I control much worse than legal areas, but I'm afraid this is not being managed, or they don't know exactly how to manage this. A little note: political preferences of youth are not addressed to elect youth, and this is quite sensible. Youth do not necessarily prefer youngsters, but those who are aligned with their ideology. So there is the main receptor of youth vote was Mélenchon in France, who is the oldest one. And the one that received most votes from the youth was Sanders, who was the oldest. And Stefan Hessel, who was really very old, he passed away, but he got a lot of votes from the youth. So there's no correlation between young leaders, but rather with those who identify themselves with the youth values, irrespective of their age.
Thank you. Everybody's ready for lunch. 3 short comments, no questions. You have given a very good overview of your research questions. I was missing a little bit the end user part, meaning that I'm not sure if you have the capacity or you consider to conduct a type of primary research among major youth organizations and get their reflections on the documents, for example, that Anna was referring to, and get their side, their view on those issues. This is just a suggestion which you might consider. Second, you mentioned the lack of strategy. Now, one good thing about Erasmus Plus is that it started to consider giving funds for building strategies. Previously, the Commission said that, okay, here's the money, develop a training program. Now I see initiatives where they say, here's the money, develop a strategy. And I'm not sure how it's going on in the area of youth, but this is definitely the case in the area of education. So in the future, they might consider funding building strategies. And third is, I would recommend that you be careful with quoting this cow example, that how much money the European Commission spends on one cow as opposed to one university student. This has been going around, this data, for a number of years now. I meet that at different conferences. And once I had the opportunity to ask these questions from a commissioner, they got very nervous. So if you want to quote that, be very careful and underpin with the calculations, because that seems to be a sensitive issue. But I find it outrageous, and you are close. It's somewhere around 7 and 8 times more on a cow than on an actual university student. So that's all. Thank you.
Empezando por el final.
I will start by the end. I am aware that I should be careful. That explains part of my second response, because I come precisely from those youth organizations. When I talk about them, sometimes I find it hard to do it with an academic rigor instead of doing it from a first person. The example of cows, we use it at youth organization, and the source is the European Youth Forum and the studies that this youth forum has carried out. But it is true what you say. I haven't really talked about the opinion of youth organizations, because I didn't want to bias the debates. I did not want to talk about my professional previous field before I re-embarked in academics. But yes, I am definitely discussing that in my analysis. And in fact, political stances of youth organizations serve to me as a parameter of ethical rationale of the legal regulations. For instance, if a regulation is done for the youth and young organizations do not like it, then there is a problem, even though it can be very well designed from a legal point of view. But of course, young people are not always right, so an efficient participation of them does not mean to giving them all, but at least explaining on why there is no positive response on a young people request. And that's why I am trying to handling these opinions with care. I have a political opinion within those youth organizations, but when I try and analyze the rule, I try not to think as that young person. I try to see it from a legal point of view only. With regard to the lack of strategies, it is true that Erasmus Plus is favoring alliances, and that is something to be thankful for. And they're led by the civil society in many countries, which is also very positive. We have 1 more minute. If we have any more questions? No? Okay, then thank you, Enrique. Thank you all for being here. The session ends now.